to South Africa, with very high levels of competition, low HHIs, and prices have come down in some of our countries, like Sri Lanka, under $5 and under 5% of monthly income. Of course, there are others where it's 5 to 10% of monthly income, the others where it's over 10% of monthly income. So affordability varies, certainly. But very, very small amounts of people in our region are actually online, so that's the obvious challenge. And in light of this, the reaction has been, or the trend is for the government to come in the form of creating national broadband plans, which seems to be incredibly fashionable. Second, to government to get into the funding of the rollout of broadband plans. And they have had varying levels of success. So we've had Malaysia, one of the richer countries in our region, who went directly into a public-private partnership with the dominant operator without really going in for any kind of competitive procurement or negotiating with any other operators. On the plus side, it's had great success. It's met all its rollout targets as of now. On the negative side, I think there was a whole lot of money left on the table that could have been better used, because they didn't really look to the market for anything. They just cut a deal. And the backroom conversations are there were other deals that were better economically for the government to be cut. So, it's a plus and a minus. Then you have countries like Australia, which seem to be currently in limbo, which has set up the great, regulatory and policy framework for good competition in broadband and government investment. But then there has been a new review under the new government, and it's sort of been slowly rolled out. So the speed has certainly slowed. We have countries like India and Indonesia getting into this game, the governments using universal service funds and various other forms of financing, with very, let's say, vague levels of detail, which we worry about, allowing the incumbent to own the backbone that's being newly rolled out, granted through a new entity, but it's still the incumbent, allowing the backhaul and the access network to be provided by the same person, seriously, potentially damaging competition. So there's a whole range of things going on in Asia when we look at what's happening in broadband. And the one thing that they, I suppose, haven't addressed is actually, perhaps should have been done before they jumped into broadband plans, is to remove the other existing bottlenecks, like access to international gateways, the high international lease line prices, and so on and so forth. So we haven't really explored those options so far. So we've tried to jump into policy solutions with heavy government participation.
Thank you, Alani. You already touched upon many of the issues that we definitely want to discuss today, not just the broadband plans and the ability of broadband plans to provide the right vision and guidance in the countries, but also how do they translate in terms of practical implementation, and also the necessary regulations that need to be in place when needed to facilitate the growth of the sector. Perhaps, Paul, you can give us your perspective, not only on some of the items that Elani already mentioned, to what extent you feel that some are trends that you also see from your experience, what are some that you may see from a different perspective, but most importantly, as Microsoft, as the private sector, what are some of the good practices on the policy side that you have seen being applied in some countries that we can learn from and start thinking about to deal with some of these challenges that Elani mentioned?
Okay. Maybe it's useful to back up just a little bit and explain what Microsoft is trying to do in this space. We originally approached the access space really from a research perspective in Spectrum. And the idea was that we're sort of in a mobile first, cloud first world where more and more things are going to come online, and they will come online wirelessly. And while there will be, fiber backhaul, et cetera, we need to find smarter ways to use the spectrum, and that includes a wide range of technologies, including smarter antenna technology, cognitive radios, the ability to dynamically frequency shift, the ability to have tiered levels of service, that is tiered and tiered users on a particular piece of spectrum, priorities, first priority, second priority, third priority, et cetera. So we've done lots of research into how some of those technologies would work, and eventually we wanted to put them to the test. And the great thing about large parts of the world, and we'll just pick Africa because there's 1 billion people in Africa, and about 7% of the population is actually covered by a wireless sort of canopy. So there's plenty of opportunity, and there's also difficult economics with today's mainstream technology. And the question is, what could we do? The first project we put together was in Kenya, and it's instructive because when you look at a project like that, you're really doing the equivalent of building the entire airline industry at the same time. So if you were to try to start the airline industry today and have what you have with, runways, air traffic control systems, lots of different airplanes, scheduling, beautiful airports and not so beautiful airports, there's a lot that has to come together to do that. And so we chose a part of Kenya that had no electricity, just for starters, and it basically didn't have any of the baseline infrastructure, was not a good candidate for any of the legacy technology. But it had all of the needs, which was can you bring ICT into the education space? Can you bring it into healthcare? Can you connect government offices? There's government there, but government with no access to to be able to connect with the capital. And but in addition to understanding the needs of the population, then we had to figure out how do we put the technical infrastructure together in a way that is sustainable. Can we find people, an entity or multiple entities to be the ISP, to build the network, to operate the network? Can we build or cause to be built applications that are appropriate for the particular location? And so we were really trying to pull all of these pieces together, and effectively we did. And we've already heard about the government issue, and of course, to start this project, the most important thing was to get the support of the government and the actual involvement of the government, investment by the government, not in money, but in sort of intellectual capital, and in terms of trying to get behind what the project was trying to do. Now, we're roughly 1.5 years into that particular project being up and running. It's now connected many schools, the government offices, healthcare facilities, Red Cross, et cetera, and it's built into the computer labs are now built into the curriculum of the schools, and that's all working very well. There's a test and measurement program that we're running along with a couple of economists to try to, over the next couple of years, figure out just what did that do. But it's really important from a policy perspective that we had to address policy needs from the government's perspective in several fronts. Just communications policy, spectrum policy, education policy, health policy, general economics. And in the process of doing this, we found lots of areas working with the governments where it wasn't clear where in the government was the right place, who has the responsibility for this thing that nobody's been doing, and finding a way to actually work with them, work with the local people who are being the ISP, local industry, to actually get backhaul. So in Kenya, Kenya Light and Power actually has fiber across all the transmission towers, so that's where the connection was made. And then there was a variety of wireless technologies put into play, including some TV white spaces, which required some other investment, not money, but in terms of willingness to try something new on the part of the Kenyan regulator. We have 10 such projects now around the world. They've all basically followed the same kind of template, where you try to pull all of the local pieces together, including the application development, et cetera. So far, so good.
Thank you, thank you. So for those of you who just arrived, we are the Alliance for Affordable Internet, a global coalition of public, private, and civil society organizations working on policy and regulatory reform in developing countries. And what we are sharing with you today is through an open discussion, what are the kinds of policies and regulatory decisions that have helped, that have worked, those who have not, and why, so we can learn from each other on examples of not just good practices, but learning from our members and panelists through their experience. What are some of the concrete ways in which we can move forward to address affordability and bring more affordable internet to developing countries through this process of policy and regulatory reform. One thing I would like to come back to what you just mentioned, Paul, and others I know can also address that, is when you already touched upon not only different sectors, how one project actually is very complex in bringing together not just the investment, the infrastructure, the different sectors, the government, policy and regulation, and how all of them kind of came together as a large puzzle that is working, kind of fitting all the pieces together in an interesting way that actually works and shows results and impact. What I would like to also explore later on, hopefully we'll have time, is to what extent were some policies or regulations in place at all that facilitated some of the work that you were intending to do in some of the countries, and what was not in place that is the biggest challenge to address. Okay, so we'll get back to that. But before we do that, Venancio, I wanted to ask you to share with us some of your experience in Mozambique. I know we don't have a whole lot of time, so I must press on you to be as brief as you can so we can have as much discussion. I apologize, but it is the way it is. But Venancio, you not only are working with us, with the Alliance, as our coordinator in Mozambique, a country that we are also working in, but you were also the Minister of Science and Technology in Mozambique and up until recently, and you were a visionary and really a person who not only brought and developed a lot of the ICT world in Mozambique, but also developed the first policy in the country. One that is badly needed to be updated. So tell us about the previous experience. What are the gaps now, and what are the things that need to be done to move forward?
Thank you very much, Sonny. Several times you use it, I was, and then in one of you said I was a visionary. I think I'm still, yes, I'm still.
You are still a visionary.
Yes, I still am. One big problem that we have noticed is that we pretend, we working on IT, in particular on internet, we pretend to give the impression that we insist and the government insists. As a consequence, sometimes we have tensions on what you want to do because you don't have enough room or space because the government is not listening to you. So what I have learned, and maybe I can share, is that the first step is that we have to understand that we are the changing agent. We are really, we are missionaries also. We are special people. We have a vision. So for some of us who are religious, you know what is the meaning of being someone who has to sell or transmit a message to others. This is very serious, but it's very important. So what I have learned and what I did was to spend a lot of time doing interaction with the government officials, starting from the president, prime minister, ministers, governors, trying to have the same languages as them. Second, I did small things to demonstrate how powerful and important was technology. This did help a lot. You know, one of the things you will not believe was to develop a small decision support system for the president. And I said, you just track, when you give permission to minister to travel, you just track when he's going, when he's coming back, did he report, etc. And this was very interesting because I linked this to internet and email. And I made a statement that the internet was something very important, it's power. Internet is power. So if you link these words with what you want to do, then it's very likely that you will succeed. This did help us a lot to establish the national ICT policy, and we created a movement and a strategy. We followed some of the recommendations. One is that you need the champions. The other one, you need to make a link between the government programs and the internet development. We tried as much as possible to do this, and the policy was easy to develop. Now, where we are struggling is we have the national policy, but you need to have the sectorial policy. So maybe something we did not do very well was to leave the sectorial policy to the sectors, but not the same movement as the overall policy. So for instance, the broadband issues and the telecommunication issues, we leave for the specific ministry to deal with this. The content we leave with the specific ministry to develop. And the practice is showing the pace, the speed in which the sectorial development takes place and the building a consensus among the different partners is taking more time, and the results are slow ongoing. Why A4AI connected with us is that we believe on the alliance and the coalition. We believe that designing the sectorial issues, dealing with the sectorial issues, but using some examples of what is going on in the rest of the world, using the experience that exists within the alliance, then it's a plus. I stop here. It's okay?
Thank you. Thank you. So this is a perfect segue to ask you, Jacqueline, who you are the current advisor to the Minister of Communications and Transport in Mozambique. Obviously, we're very proud to be working with you and supporting the process of policy reform in Mozambique. But what are for you your most important challenges? I know we've had some of those discussions in Mozambique, but share with us some of those. But most importantly, I think it would be nice to hear from you, to what extent is the government in its current plans having a better way of coordinating some of these aspects that Venancio and I think Paul's also alluded to, which is bringing a lot of the pieces of the puzzle together, that it's not just about broadband access, that's an important piece, but how can we make it clearly important and clearly beneficial to all the other potential users?
The first part of the question was the pressing issues, I guess, for the government and for the country. I think I would start by saying affordability is an issue for us, internet affordability. And I say this because when I arrived here, the first message I received was from my mobile operator that it would cost me about $10 per megabit for internet access here, which is 7 times more expensive than a minute of phone call to my home country. So you might say that that has to do with roaming agreements, and so it's expensive for everybody. But at the same time, you have to realize that even within country, internet costs about $60 a month, fixed internet connectivity in your home. And this is in a country where GDP per capita is $560. So it's expensive. We have the challenge of having to somehow bring the prices down, and we've been working towards that from Venantia's time with the ICT strategy, with liberalizing the telecommunications sector. We've passed legislation on infrastructure sharing, although that particular piece of legislation was not well adhered by the operators, and consequently we had to introduce a third mobile operator that helped to reduce a little bit of the costs. And so I would think that looking forward, one of our focus areas is to build on partnerships that will help us educate, create capacity within our market, and that's with the operators, with the users, on how effectively they can use telecommunications and in specific internet services to better life and to increase or develop our economy. I think that's what we're trying to do through partnerships, through capacity building. Those are focus areas for us as a government to see.
Okay. Do you think that some of the coordination work is also helping, those partnerships are helping that potential coordination that we've alluded to?
Yes, I definitely think so. I mean, one of the parts that I forgot to say is, with the work that we're doing with the Alliance for Affordable Internet, we've seen a lot more of the actors within the sector come together and feel open to express their views. Previously, if it was a government-organized event, there would be a little bit of anxiety on expressing exactly what the issues were. But through the first forum that we've had through the Alliance for Affordable Internet, we've identified 3 key areas that for our sector and our market are important, and those include infrastructure sharing, investment in infrastructure, second and third.
We could go on to those later.
Yeah,
okay.
we'll go on to those.
Yeah.
And so I think for the plan for the coming months and years through this alliance is to work on those specifically, create some regulations or reform some regulations that will help us get to where we need to be.
Right, thank you, thank you. So Yassine, you are new to A4AI, but you're not new to any of these issues. You are our Latin America coordinator, and you also very familiar with the challenges in Latin America, obviously, including the country that you live, Dominican Republic, that we hope to also engage with very soon. And so we've heard about some of the challenges in Asia. We've heard about some of the challenges in Africa through the example of Mozambique. Give us some examples from Latin America, and hopefully some of you from Latin America here in the room can also share some of the ones that you have in your regions and in your countries. But what are some that you see taking place that are pressing for us as an alliance to tackle?
Sure, thank you. Yes, what I've seen in the last couple of months that I've been working with the research on this area and starting building the alliance networks, let's say, in the region, all the range of challenges are present at different levels. It's really, every country is unique, and in every country you will find priorities, or challenges that are different from other countries. So the idea of having a national focus and really work with national coalition is very important. I think in Mexico you have a new law and everything, but then the implementation, the separation of the regulator with the enforcement of regulation, that was a big issue before, now it's going to be solved, but there are still a lot of issues in terms of new entrants in the market, of competition, allowing, let's say, healthy competition, and things like that. In Haiti, they still are very far away with the law that is 1987. Yeah, the telecom law is 1987, and one of the big challenges that the government has is its own budget, and telecom is one of the main providers of income for the national budget, so through taxes. So they are very, and the regulator is really more playing the role of income generation for government than really regulating or helping developing new technologies or even bringing the cost down or developing the infrastructure, which is very badly needed in Haiti in particular. In Dominican Republic, I think one of the main challenges is that everybody understand what are the challenges of the others. Often the government is trying to do his best, but he has, the free trade agreement, less revenue in its revenue, so it raises, you have taxes. So you have to convince him some way that if lower taxes on this will enable more business to grow, will then generate more income through taxes down the road. But it's difficult so you have really that idea of getting to the people together, the telecom, the regulators, the academics, the researchers, the users and the potential users of broadband, and demonstrating with hard facts, with the hard data, the potential impact of reducing this cost. And then you have a menu of solutions that we have mentioned already here: sharing infrastructure, a new view of licensing, or new ways of managing spectrum, and all that. So we have a big menu of solutions. What we have really the challenge is so everybody sits together, understands that really the problem of the other actors, government, private sector, and else, and creating this common basic consensus or collective vision, let's say, this multi-stakeholder approach. I think that is the plus that we're bringing in here, and that could help on that way.
Thank you. If you have any questions while we are discussing, please raise your hand, and we're happy to bring your questions to the panel as we have the discussion before I completely open to all of you. But feel free to raise your hand. Excuse me. Pepper, you have a lot of experience. All of these issues are not new to you. I think in addition to the experience in the countries that Cisco works, you also have a lot of experience with research and analysis, really looking closely at what has worked, what has not, what are the things that have a highest impact. Share with us some of that, and especially I think it would be useful for us to hear a little bit about your research around how important it is to have very comprehensive broadband plans, and what does it mean to have a comprehensive broadband plan? Because one of the questions that we struggle as we work in several countries is that the concept of what a broadband plan is, and Alani, you mentioned that earlier, the difference between the different countries, it's very meaningful, and it has completely different impacts.
Yeah. So thank you. Yes. So one of we've been talking about broadband plans for quite some time. And Paul and I sit on the UN Broadband Commission, and one of the things that we've been advocating there for, I guess it's 3 or 4 years now, is that every country should have a broadband plan. But we were making assumptions that that's a good thing. So what we did was we teamed up some of our analysts, with colleague and I from Cisco, with the Broadband Commission, and we actually asked the empirical question: if you have a broadband plan, does it make a difference? And the methodology was a panel regression, 160 countries, 10 years of data, so it's not just correlational, it's causal. And what we found, there were 4 high-level takeaways, and I'm going to drill down on one of them. One, if you have a plan, it does make a difference. And we were very loose on our definition of plan. It could be a comprehensive plan, it could be a strategy announced by the head of state, it could be called a strategy, it could be called a plan, it could be called any one of a number of things. But having one statistically significantly and dramatically increased broadband adoption, right? Because part of it was about, and this was the question earlier about a champion. It's leadership. If you have national leadership that focuses on the need for broadband, it actually makes a difference. So having a plan makes a difference. Second, competition makes a huge difference. And I'm going to come back to that and drill down on that a little bit. Third, public-private partnerships were more effective in, again, the result of increasing broadband adoption, especially, primarily in emerging economies. And what we meant by that was when governments try to do it alone, build, operate, and go alone, they are not as effective as where there's a private sector involvement. When the private sector does it by itself, there are gaps, especially in rural areas. So the most effective plans, again, with the metric of the outcome is broadband adoption. The most effective plans were those where it was government setting out framework and the primary investment coming from the private sector, and then there are a variety of ways in which government and private sector work to fill gaps, and there's a lot of different mechanisms. And that's what we mean by public-private partnership. It's not necessarily a joint venture. It's where the government and the private sector are both active players. Fourth takeaway was that because of the technologies, because of the markets, because of how dynamic everything is, the national plan needs to be refreshed. It needs to be reviewed probably every 2 years, no longer. We found that the average national broadband plan was 7 years old. So they were like 3 generations, in many cases, out of sync, just because things move so fast. Let me go back to competition. What we found was, it was more difficult statistically on the fixed side, but when it came to mobile, the difference between competition, monopoly and competition in mobile broadband, there was a 30 to 40% increase in broadband adoption where there was competition over the baseline. Very, very dramatic impact. And this goes back to some of the policy questions and some of the things that we heard earlier on the panel about the importance of competition. That leads to the question about infrastructure sharing, right? So how do you share infrastructure without reducing competition? How do you share infrastructure without reducing innovation? And the way to do that is sharing passive infrastructure, which reduces dramatically the cost of build out and entry, right? Because it's essentially civil engineering, building towers, trenches, and so on. But allowing the competition in the active elements. So you can have, separate licenses hanging on the end of a network on a shared tower, shared mast. So you can get the benefits of the passive infrastructure to lower the cost and speed deployment, especially in the rural areas, while not having a penalty from the benefits of competition or the benefits of innovation. So those are some of the findings that we had in this study, and they're directly related to the policy back to the work that we're doing as an alliance.
Exactly. Thank you. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. I think that is a perfect, you can follow up, Mike, with your work and research and thinking on infrastructure sharing, having in mind what you've heard from all of the panelists, including from Pepper's research. Your experience in many different countries in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia, does your experience and your research reflect similar findings? And in what way, can you share with us maybe some examples of how this has worked in specific countries?
I should point out that we're at fairly early stages in the research process. But in our initial scoping of the area of infrastructure sharing, it was clear that this has major potential for improving connectivity, especially in the more remote and rural areas. When we consider that the cost of deploying fiber optic networks and base stations for mobile broadband, for example, 70 to 80% of that cost is the civil works. So if that cost can only be done once rather than repeated by every operator, this really changes the whole picture in terms of the return on investment in moving to the more marginal areas where the level of demand is much lower. So this really makes it possible to actually gain a huge area of coverage to interest the private sector in deploying infrastructure. So the basic idea here is what we call a dig once policy, where For example, modeling it, this is on very similar policies in Europe, where if an operator digs a trench, they must lay additional ducts in that trench so that other operators can come in and blow their cable at a later date or at the same time. So this sort of policy can really radically change the picture in terms of how much we need to subsidize connectivity in remote and rural areas and bring down the price generally for broadband connectivity. I think, there are many other areas of this in terms of coordinated cross-sectoral infrastructure sharing, so that, for example, whenever a new road is built, a duct is placed, or many ducts is placed in that along that road project, and that kind of additional pre-planning of infrastructure rollout is incredibly cost-saving, because of course if you're planning in that duct into a new road, the cost of putting that in is very marginal compared to the cost of digging up a road or having to trench from scratch. Similarly, with deploying a high-tension power grid, if you plan to put fiber optic cable in that grid or augment the existing fiber optics in the high-tension cables, which are already necessary for coordinated switching of the power stations, this cost is marginal. It's just the cost of the fiber, really. So again, compared to the cost of trying to string new fiber over those pylons, very expensive. Similarly, just actually having to gain access to the rights of way and negotiate with many different landowners or many different state, provincial or national and municipal governments. Again, if that rights of way has already been negotiated for the purposes of other sorts of infrastructure, be it roads, electricity, the same applies to gas pipelines, oil pipelines, and rail transport networks. So if there's an anticipation that we can ensure that the fiber infrastructure is planned into all of these infrastructures, then there can be huge savings in the deployment costs. I think in the interests of time, I should stop there.
Thank you, Mike. So Jennifer Arun from Google. Google took a new approach. And as a company that I guess people, don't necessarily see as an infrastructure company, actually recently invested in the Kampala, fiber ring, and you can tell us about it. But why did you decide to do that? And what are the kinds of challenges also that you, as a new provider, as a new operator, let's call it, even on a wholesale basis, had to face? But if you could also address, so we can go on to a few other topics, because we also see Google as a different kind of company, a company that is also focused on content and other issues. So how are you balancing actually some of these interests, not just the ability of having the right infrastructure and a lower cost structure to the provision of service, with the ability to provide content that is demanded at the local level, especially?
Thanks, Sonia. So the project that you mentioned we call Project Link, and it's a wholesale metro fiber network that Google has built and operates. And it is an example of shared infrastructure. But there are a couple of important factors. One is that Google does not have an exclusive license to build infrastructure in Kampala. And I think, as Pepper mentioned, that's really important. We also believe in a competitive market. So, for example, there is a mobile operator in that market that wanted to build their own infrastructure, and they also have been able to do that. But one of the benefits and why we decided to try this is because there are plenty of mobile operators, and particularly ISPs that serve small and medium-sized businesses, that aren't able to build their own fiber infrastructure and are stuck using a backhaul, usually microwave backhaul, that has some constraints, particularly as they're starting to offer more data services. And so in building this shared infrastructure network, we were able to lower the overall cost basis for the industry as a whole by building once, and in this case it's active and passive infrastructure, and then selling to any of the licensed operators that wanted to buy from us. And one important thing we also did is, rather than charge by bit, which is how this industry tends to do things, we actually use a flat fee, because we really want to encourage our mobile operator and ISP customers to encourage their users to use more. So, I mean, I think some of the things that we faced, I actually think we're asked often, why did we choose Kampala, Uganda as our example here? And there were many, many wonderful reasons why. But one reason is because the regulator there did have very clear and importantly published regulations and guidelines in terms of building fiber infrastructure. And I think that's important. There are many countries that have developed guidelines, but sometimes they can be hard to interpret or even difficult to find. And in this case, everything was published online. It was very transparent, and so it was easy to understand what was possible. Your second question in terms of balancing infrastructure and content, the important thing about the internet is that it is open, and there's, one reason we really want to do this was to help the local content providers not just use the internet, but provide content for the internet. So in improving internet speeds and quality for the industry as a whole, we really hope that means that local content providers are more able to upload music, upload videos, share their story with the world. It's not just about using the content that is already there.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Any comments you'd like to make? Anyone? Very quiet. Okay.
My name is Peter Bruck. I'm the chairman of the World Summit Award, which runs in 160 countries the contest for best practice with quality contents. When you look at the infrastructure costs and putting infrastructure in, the interesting issue is what happens with the infrastructure. I think what Jennifer, you painted is a very naive picture. When you look at what the situation now is in the US, you have 34% of the infrastructure use of the internet used by one company, by Netflix. So we are moving into a situation where streaming, video streaming portals and operators are actually hogging the main of the infrastructure without ever paying for it. And what is interesting to me is how you're actually wanting to deal with that. I mean, there's, on the one hand, you have a big activist movement towards net and arguing net neutrality. But on the other hand, you have telcos which are refusing actually to put the infrastructure in for which use they are not getting paid. So then people say, okay, we need governments to take the lead. But what is the correct answer for that from your point of view?
So, Jennifer, if you don't mind answering, and perhaps others panelists, I'm sure you have some comments on some of the questions. Anybody else, please raise your hand.
Sure. I think, one thing is the content providers like Microsoft or Google or Facebook do spend a lot of money building infrastructure and trying to bring their content as close to the end user as possible. So it isn't just operators who are spending money on infrastructure. And of course, in the case of Project Link, that's a clear place where Google has spent money on infrastructure that is used not just by us, but by all the operators and ISPs in the market. And in an earlier session, we also talked about, and the president of ETNO talked about Project Loon, where we are working with mobile operators and seeing if Loon or high altitude balloons will be a way to deliver internet. So I think there are a lot of infrastructure investments being made, both by the more traditional mobile operators, but also by the content providers. And of course, Microsoft's investment in TV white space networks is another great example.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to add any comments on that, or should we go for more questions? Okay. Allison in the back, you had a question. Please go first, and then lady here as well. And then, go ahead.
I have been straddling sessions, so perhaps you could just guide me on whether this question... Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I have been straddling sessions, so please do tell me if the question has already been asked. But I think it's really important in these affordability and access workshops and sessions that we really address the ecosystem and the need for integrated regulation and some of the issues around content and the human rights issues that are integrally related in these subjects. And I'd particularly like to ask Google if the decision in Uganda, the anti-gay legislation that has briefly been repealed, but I understand is being restored into Parliament, is being reintroduced into Parliament next week. The decision on that affected your decision at all about going ahead with Kampala, because your announcement about selecting Kampala as the first city to introduce this network came within a month or so of that announcement. And I think it would have been a very powerful statement to have said, you know, although all the work has been done to demonstrate that Uganda's in need of this, this is actually going to be thought about or reconsidered in terms of the human rights infringements that are taking place there.
Thank you, Alison. I'm going to take a few more questions before you answer. Please keep them in mind. We don't have a whole lot of time, but we did start late, so I'm going to allow myself a few more minutes for the panel. Actually, these ladies first, and then you, please. And were there any other hands up? Okay, go ahead, please.
Thank you. My name is Mindell Delatorre, and I'm the chief of the International Bureau at the Federal Communications Commission in the United States. And I just wanted to follow on. It's not really a question. It's just more of an experience that we've had. Bob Pepper mentioned that, you know, countries' broadband plans, they tend to, you know, go forward. And I can tell you as a regulator that one of the things that's very nice about having a broadband plan is that it brings constancy, and it also brings some consistency to the actions that we take. So we have a broadband plan, and it doesn't change with whoever is the chair of the agency. Maybe how you get there, it might, but it does create a lot of stability for the people who work there. They also have goals that they are supposed to meet. You know what you're supposed to do. We can always go back to that broadband plan, and we can also see if we exceed those goals. And I think that accountability is extremely important. Thank you.
Mindell. Go ahead.
My name is Emila Ushe, and I work with APC, Association for Progressive Communications. And my question is directed to Mozambique, the visionary and the ICT Minister Advisor. You mentioned that Mozambique has 3 focus areas, I think, in ICT policy, including infrastructure sharing. I just wanted to find out if public access is also part of your focus areas, or maybe it has fallen off your agenda, or is it something that you want to focus on? And is it, in general, for the panel, is it something that the Alliance for Affordable Internet also looks at, or is just infrastructure? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll let Jennifer answer first to the question in the back, and whoever else wants to add any comment, and then Mozambique. You know, I can also answer from the perspective of A4AI, but you should answer first.
So I'll be really brief. I think those who know Google know we have been and are a very large supporter of gay rights. And of course, those laws, you know, we did have discussions about them. But we also really believe that the internet and access to the internet and more access to the internet and higher quality access to the internet brings people more information and also opens the debate on topics such as this. So it is something we considered, but we really would like to see, you know, quite frankly, everyone in the world have access to the internet, and I think that helps encourage debate on controversial, or what can seem to be controversial topics.
Anyone wants to add anything? Okay. On the question for Mozambique, I'll let the colleagues answer first. I'll just say one comment that the work of A4AI through the A4AI Mozambique Coalition is indeed actually addressing infrastructure sharing in the context of an open access framework. The country has just passed a new legislation that the colleagues can say more specifics about, but it's based on the premise that an open access framework will be implemented, and that will be the basis for the new market in the country?
This is a very good question. And the success we have in Mozambique is because we give a lot of attention to the public access. We are still not happy with the number of people who have access to internet. But those ones who have a possibility of getting access, we make them get full access to it. I will give you 2 examples. One is that for 3 years, consecutive years, we were able to get a prize from the UN on a program called e-participation. But because very early, on a very early stage, on 90s already, we started by establishing what we called by telecenters, and then we moved it to CMCs, the community multimedia centers. We also established what we call by provincial digital resource centers. All these centers, they make available internet and ICT facilities for those ones who, for one or another reason, they don't have access to internet. As part also for e-participation, we decided that Mozambicans should not go to departments, government departments, to resolve their issues when they can use internet for that. So we have a couple of applications that are available online that people can make use of them. So yes, the public access is a very big preoccupation from our side. Of course, the problem of infrastructure is quite serious to widen access. So while we are still working on the establishment of a broadband or massive access, the limit that we have, that is on the hand of the operators, it's very expensive, as my colleague just mentioned.
Jacqueline, do you want to add?
I will clarify what I was trying to say, I think, before. I think public access is a priority for us, and affordability of internet is a priority for us. As such, through this alliance, we've come together with all the stakeholders within the sector, and we identified 3 main areas in which we will work with as an alliance, and that was infrastructure sharing and investment, taxation, data collection, and reporting. And that's the work that we're doing through this alliance. But in addition to that, the government of Mozambique has embarked and identified other areas that it thinks that can improve public access and affordability of the internet. And that includes projects and other activities such as the establishment or improvement of our IXPs so that you have local content and cheaper internet access for everybody. Also, we're experimenting with pilot TV white spaces, uses of pilot TV white space, so you can have data access in the rural areas. And what else? Yeah, okay. So there's a lot of other activities and other identified areas.
Okay, I guess we have a question from a remote participant, please. And if anyone has any other questions before we close, due to time, please raise your hand so I also give you a chance. Go ahead.
Thank you. There's a participant who wants to ask something about the question. The question is, corruption at mafia in telecom and media sector hurting broadband plans in developing countries. So how we can address this?
What exactly
So
is the question?
the question is about corruption in the telecom and media sectors and how it's hurting broadband plans in developing countries. How can we address this?
Anyone? Elani, go ahead, please.
I don't know if, how we can access this, but I mean, India is the poster child for how corruption completely messed up the sector. They, 2 years ago, revoked, I think, around 114 or 80 2G licenses and the minister went to jail and heads rolled because licenses were awarded under, let's say, rather opaque conditions, right? That's being very generous. Now, they should have gone to the jail. That's not the issue. I mean, this failure of awarding licenses, clearly, what that did to India is it scared everyone so much that it delayed the awarding of the 3G licenses. You know, everyone in Asia had 3G. India got into the game 4 or 5 years late, right? Because nobody wanted to touch that with the 10-foot pole. So this is a fundamental issue. Now, I think I can say this in public. In Sri Lanka, we are no less transparent about the award of licenses. We don't know how they get awarded. On the other hand, the one thing I can say is once an operator gets a license, because capital markets work reasonably well, they have to give a return on investment. So they actually do roll out. Now that's the contradiction. So even under non-transparent conditions, which I'm not proposing or advocating, if you get licenses, things actually happen. Now that's the weird thing.
Thank you, Alani. Pepper, you wanted to add a comment?
Not about corruption, but about something else that had come up, which I think is extremely important. And you raised it, and that is the taxes. Without embarrassing a particular country, we were in a meeting with the minister of a country, and the minister said that 70% of the cost of building out a network was taxes and fees. Right? That is a huge barrier to entry that raises the costs and harms consumers. It suppresses demand, and it's completely counterproductive. And that's something that I think, we've all been talking about, because what we're looking, one of the objectives, and we talked about competition and passive infrastructure, how do we get build out of networks rapidly to the places that are unserved, right? Government should be facilitating that and not taxing it or putting barriers in the way to do that, because it thinks that the operators are some kind of a cash machine, because it only comes back and ends up hurting consumers, because at the end of the day, the companies have to recover that, so then it forces the companies to be a tax collector, just like we heard sometimes the regulator's a tax collector, right? So if the objective is increasing broadband deployment and increasing broadband adoption, we should be lowering the cost of entry and making it easier for building out those networks and getting the benefits to everybody across the countries.
Mm-hmm. In fact, two of the countries that A4AI is already engaging with, Nigeria and Ghana, have selected taxation as one of the critical policy issues that they need support, and that we're working with them. So we actually have work plans in place right now through our coalition and working with all of the different stakeholders exactly to address some quick solutions to reduce taxation and some more longer-term solutions to revamp the taxation and duty system. So precisely because of those issues. Khaled, you had a question, and then I think after that we may need to close, unless I see any other arms up.
No, a comment, actually. Helani's answer sparked some thoughts, and I was thinking that perhaps it's not a matter of bad processes, because at the end of the day, perhaps the private sector or investor can circumvent those or adapt their practices toward that. But it's the uncertainty around and the washy-washy, these processes that this day is this way and the other day is another way, that perhaps hampers some type of investment. So I want to ask your thought on that.
Sure. I mean, if there's risk, people want a higher rate of return. But I think countries that are broadly corrupt are consistently broadly corrupt. And business operators, including telcos, very quickly figure out what that cost of corruption is. And it's built into any bid that they make. And in fact, we've seen instances So there's a lovely natural experiment in Bangladesh when one of the governments of one of the ladies was thrown out by the military government. And the biggest problem the business people faced was, I don't know how much of a bribe I should now pay because the system has changed. And they were very comfortable when the other lady took over. So it's not very clear. I'm not advocating any of this officially, but this is just how things are.
Yassine, you're going to give me, yeah, please go ahead. I think that's the last question that we have to take, because some of us actually have to leave. We understand. Thank you, Pepper, for being here and supporting, as always. Please go ahead.
My name is Ugo. I'm from Nigeria. Yes, the issue of taxation has been mentioned already. It's a problem, yes. I may not be speaking authoritatively, but I know that there's a proposition on the ground by the Internet Exchange Point for some sort of government intervention to ensure broadband penetration. Yes, it's cheaper at the coastal towns, so now the issue is for it to, go into the hinterlands, and of course the issue of infrastructure, getting them there is there. So the IXPN, the Internet Exchange Point of Nigeria, is proposing to the telecom regulator to to provide some sort of, to intervene, to ensure that Internet Exchange points are built in the 6 geopolitical zones of the country, and fund ISPs to provide the necessary, to have them interconnected, and so that it would be more accessible to people in the hinterland. I know a committee has been set up. It's underway, so something is being done. I may not be able to give all the facts, but I'm aware of this development.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think even though I would love to continue the discussion, that is very interesting, and there's a lot more that could be covered, we covered some of the key elements already. Are you looking at me because you really have to make a comment? Okay. So I apologize that we don't have more time, but it's just the nature of things. As things get more interesting and we warmed up, then we have to stop. So I'll just simply say that for those of you who are interested, please look up the Alliance for Affordable Internet. Look up what we're doing. A4AI.org is very simple. We're very proud of what we're doing with all of your support. Many of you here in this room. Come to us, join, share the process, and also support us in facilitating reform in these countries, not just in the ways that all of you already mentioned through well-designed broadband plans, better taxation policy, spectrum policy we didn't even touch today, but that's another area that we're working in many countries, consumer awareness and protection, many, many issues that are critical in many developing countries to push for affordable internet. And that's really our goal, push for affordable internet through very concrete policy and regulatory reform. So thank you all for your participation, all the panelists. Feel free to come and talk to them. They have a lot to share, a lot more than what you've heard. And thank you also for being here.